All right, it is buffering, so we should be good to go here shortly. Okay, we're good. All right, we are going to get started in 4 minutes.
Good evening, everybody. This is Patricia Blick, and we're going to start at 6 o'clock. We're just getting everything lined up.
Okay, I am going to start the webinar now.
Great. It is 6 o'clock. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our October preservation conversation. Holly Hope presenting Flora, Fauna, and Faces, reading cemetery symbolism. I'm Patricia Blick, Executive Director of the QQA, and I'm joined by Shelley Stormo, our Membership and Events Coordinator. I would like to thank our donors as well as our corporate and individual members who are able to continue our educational programs with your support. You can find a list of our corporate members on our website at quapaw.com. If you're not a member of the QQA and you believe in our mission, preserving Greater Little Rock's historic places, we invite you to join and support the work that we do. Please go to quapaw.com to join for as little as $35 per year or to make a donation. If you join or donate at the $100 level, you will receive our Never, Never, Never Give Up t-shirt. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know that we will be taking your questions at the end of her talk. Please type your questions in the chat area of Zoom. We are also sharing this program on YouTube, so you can enter your questions in the comment section. On to tonight's preservation conversation. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, our friend and colleague, Holly Hope. Holly is responsible for facilitating and organizing cemetery preservation workshops that invite the public to participate in saving community cemeteries. She writes and edits National and Arkansas Register of Historic Places nominations for submission to the National Park Service. As part of the community outreach team at AHPP, she lectures on various historic topics and assists the K through 12 coordinator with reaching out to the children of the state. Please join me in welcoming Holly.
Hello.
Holly, the screen is all yours, so feel free to share.
All right. Here we go. You see me?
Yes, you look great, and we see your presentation.
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk tonight about cemetery iconography, and that is another word for symbolism. The images that are commonly displayed on gravestones are called iconography. Iconography on gravestones is aesthetic, but it also tells cultural and economic stories. And nothing's happening. I'm sorry, my slide is not moving.
You might just want to scroll down or arrow down.
It's just frozen.
Why don't we stop screen sharing and open it up again? Oh, there you go. Why don't you try that arrow?
Yeah, I'll try it that way. I was using the pad. Okay, sorry. During the Victorian era, cemeteries were very important to families and the community. And visual symbols on gravestones were revealing about the interred because they served as a message from the family about that person. So those messages are still there to speak to us, which is why it's very important to preserve these historic resources. Symbols can tell us about transportation networks of an area because communities that were close to major roads or rivers would have a higher number of commercially carved markers with that popular symbolism that you see so much on gravestones. So a town that may seem deserted today might have ornate markers that were shipped from major cities because at one time that community had a large population. They had money, and there were educated individuals there who were aware of trends in art and stylish movements. If you had money, your gravestone or your mausoleum could reflect that, so markers can convey clues about the social standing of family members. Iconography can also give us an idea about where the people buried there came from by displaying a symbol that's linked to certain countries, as well as the inscriptions themselves that actually say so-and-so came from Germany or so-and-so came from France. So the most popular images you would find in cemeteries were a result of community beliefs, values, and tastes. If these symbols didn't have cultural approval, then they wouldn't sell. So they're very telling about attitudes, origins, and culture in America, not just Arkansas. Beginning in the early 18th century in America, death became less frightening and it became more about an optimistic afterlife that was facilitated by good works while the person was alive. And this change has been attributed to the First Great Awakening, which was a religious revival that took place in Europe between the 1730s and the 1740s. The awakening brought with it a denial of death and a trend of sentimentality to the point where death was seen as a state of sleep. It was no longer a punishing, hellbound eternity. A quote of the 18th century stated that the godly would die in raptures of holy joy. But prior to that, you might hear, "As you are now, so once was I, rejoicing in my bloom. As I am now, you too will lie, dissolving in your tomb." Within the century, the movement spread to America and funerary terminology changed. Burial grounds and graveyards were then called cemeteries, which means dormitory or sleeping chamber. So I'm just going to reference East Coast iconography for a minute because Arkansas symbolism was influenced by markers found there through the migration of family members and carvers. Gravestone iconography stems from the emblem tradition, which is a combination of related pictures and words. The earliest emblem style markers on the East Coast often use the death's head, like the Adam's skull that you see in this slide, that has the crossbones, winged skulls, or winged faces. And these were startling images that could serve as a message for children or the illiterate through the 19th century. I haven't seen death heads like you see on the East Coast in Arkansas gravestones, but a winged hourglass that's kind of similar to the East Coast winged skulls was found on a stone in Fairview Cemetery in Van Buren. And this image, the hourglass with wings, is similar to one printed in a 17th century English emblem book by George Wither, referring to the passing of time and life running short. The types of images found in different regions can be attributed to the different materials that are there, itinerant stonecutters, machine engraving, and current fashions. Religious shifts are cited sometimes as influences, but you can find similar images on the stones of people who didn't adhere to a particular religion. Around the Romantic era, early to mid 1800s, there was a move away from church graveyards to rural cemeteries. This time in history coincided with an interest in the artistic movement to Greek and Roman neoclassicism, which inspired the search for picturesque qualities and a growing interest in the beauty of nature. Death was also beginning to be thought of as a natural process and an opportunity for a beautiful post-mortem experience. So going to the rural cemeteries in that time could take us away from the thoughts of death by communing with nature. The combined image of willows and urns was one of the earliest symbols that stemmed from neoclassicism. Willows were internationally associated with melancholy and mourning during the Romantic era, and they became most popular in the 1820s. The reason for this was said to be because after Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena in 1815, he spent a lot of time sitting around being depressed under a willow tree, and he asked to be buried underneath it. Cuttings from the supposed willow that he was buried underneath were requested and planted all over the world. The image of the willow tree and iconography became very popular in cemeteries because it lent itself very easily to a mourning image. The shape of the willow suggests sorrow, but it can also symbolize immortality because it will still flourish even after you cut the branches off. And these are two examples from Arkansas that display the neoclassical inspiration. One has surrounding columns on it, and the classic urn is displayed on the other one. The willow is often paired with other symbols like lambs, doves, and angels, and here you see one with an urn and a lamb. Since Arkansas was very sparsely settled in the 18th century, there are no recorded carved stone commercial markers from that time. Field stones and wood were the common gravestone materials. Most field stones would have been blank, but you can find stones with legible etching from later dates, like this one. If you can read it, it says Old Man Sam on it. And this is up in Marshall. A lot of people have said back when more people went to Memorial Day celebrations, that the women would show up with a nail and re-etch the epitaph or the name into the stone so that you could read it easier. So very important activity for people. Some wooden markers have been found in a cemetery in Van Buren County, but there's not any lettering remaining on them. The 16th section cemetery in Hempstead County contained the remains of 2 early 19th century markers that were carved from bodark wood in the shape of violins. And the picture you see here is a significantly intact wooden marker from the Pioneer Cemetery at Historic Washington State Park with a death date of 1847. One of the early vernacular images that you can find on undressed regional stone is a simple heart outline. And the one on the left is dated 1823, but we really don't know if that stone was created then or sometime after the actual death date, which can be true of a lot of gravestones. The other stone is undated, that is in the Eureka Springs Cemetery. By the 19th century, with the exception of the death's heads, Arkansas stone carvers were asked to provide the same symbols that could be found in cemeteries on the East Coast. Before the Civil War, most commercial markers were done by stonemasons who did construction masonry, like the Scottish workers who helped build the old State House in Little Rock. After the Civil War, professional carvers started moving into the state, and then they started teaching other people. Some of these include individuals like James and Renton Tuna, William Funston, H.J. Wybush, and Nick Miller. Stones also made their way to Arkansas from Tennessee, Missouri, New Jersey, Indiana, and Massachusetts. And that's just a few of them. There are several from all over. Of course, the state's rivers, as I said, were like highways to towns that were close to waterways. So you would see more commercial markers in cemeteries that were adjacent to a river. And they became more widespread when railroads were developed by the 1870s. From the influence of neoclassicism, the use of flowers became standard and extensive in Victorian cemeteries from the late 1830s to the turn of the century. Flower books became very popular, and the first language of flowers dictionary was written in 1819. There was another one written by 1884, but the vocabulary didn't always mean the same thing from one resource to another. The meanings were very malleable, and you could bend them to what you felt like saying or what was most popular from, say, Bible quotes or something like that. And so this made them perfect for gravestone symbolism. Flower iconography was an obvious direction for imagery in a culture that had developed an interest in the garden aesthetic. Epitaphs that compared people to flowers were used extensively on gravestones by about 1834. Stone carvers were always asked to provide the inscription "budded on earth" or "plucked from earth to bloom in heaven," which describes the interred as an earthly flower that provided this heavenly lesson for the people who were left behind. By 1902, Sears and Roebuck mentioned the "budded on earth" epitaph in the monument sections of their catalog as one that was requested frequently. And it's thought that this could be because it was inexpensive to purchase and it was cheaper per letter than some epitaphs like "gone but not forgotten." American writers at the time also invoked the flower imagery for those who died young, but not exclusively, because it's also used on adult burials. Floral symbols were termed mirror symbols because they represented death, but they could also represent fresh budding youth in the past or in heaven. As the 20th century wore on, the use of flowers in gravestone carvings decreased. And some people suggest this is because you could more readily buy flowers, or fake flowers became popular and those could be placed on the graves instead. So here you see examples of rose imagery. And the rose was considered a symbol of the Virgin Mary, love, wisdom, and purity. Children's stones often utilized broken buds. Not always children, but it was a favorite symbol for younger people, and it was often combined with the "budded on earth" epitaph or some other variation. A rosebud was also a symbol of hope and promise, so when it was broken, it was indicative of that promise being stilled. The unopened bud could mean that a child's life had not flowered, and the broken stem signified the cutting short of that potential. Now, the rose is not always broken. Roses in different stages of growth can signify the age of the deceased. A fully budded rose in combination with a closed bud could mean that the child has a completed life in heaven, or it could stand for a mother who died in childbirth. Morning glories are often included in bouquets, and their vines are really artistically conducive to borders in vases. So you see them more often that way. The morning glory is a symbol of the resurrection because it closes at night and opens in the morning. Water lilies and the lotus are kind of unusual in Arkansas cemeteries, and they are a Chinese, Japanese, and Egyptian influence. They're symbols of death, rebirth, or the afterlife because, of course, the water lily sinks below the water and then it re-emerges. In Egyptian symbolism, it also represented the life-giving power of the Nile. And this is at Mount Holly Cemetery. This is one of very few examples of the water lily in cemeteries. I just found a couple in Calvary Cemetery in Little Rock as well, and they're just not very common. Egyptian motifs were very popular for mausoleums by the late 1920s, just before the Depression. And here again, Napoleon was an influence because of his Egyptian military campaign. The team of scientists that he took with him brought their knowledge of Egyptian art back to France. And these artistic motifs were used in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, which went on to inspire cemetery art around the world. This mausoleum in the picture is in Oakland in Fraternal Cemetery Park, and it displays vulture wings with the sun symbol or the god Ra over the top. The columns feature papyrus symbolism, and the ironwork on the door features a representation of a lotus. Easter lilies and calla lilies were very popular images for gravestones. Easter lilies were a symbol of purity, which was used to signify that you were casting off your earthly bonds to reach a more spiritual and heavenly level or ascension. Like the rose, you do see broken Easter lilies, but most of the time they're intact. Calla lilies were symbols of purity and resurrection. Evening primroses open in the evening, of course, and close in mid-morning, which is again a link to resurrection. Other funerary meanings could be eternal love and sadness. Primroses were easy to carve, and you see them a lot in relief on granite stones. An article from 1927 regarding the carving of the primrose stated that they were so simple to replicate that they were easy even for the inexperienced. So that's why you see it a lot. They're a floral symbol that's still being used today because that simplicity can be translated easily through laser etching. You don't have to have any particular skills to do it. Lilies of the valley are symbols of innocence. In funerary symbolism, it indicates renewal and resurrection or return of happiness because they're the first flowers to bloom in the spring. Daisies are a symbol of the Virgin Mary, and they're often used on children's graves. And this is attributed to the use of the daisy in depictions of the adoration for the innocence of the Christ child. It's kind of exciting when you see the daisy because you don't see that many of them. Vines are used to symbolize the relationship between God and man. And ivy is one that's seen a lot on Victorian stones, and this is because it's always green, so it can be linked to immortality and fidelity. It can also signify an eternal embrace, as well as being a symbol of the Trinity with its 3 leaves. A lot of times you'll see the oak leaves and the ivy together on stones for husband and wife, because the oak stands for sturdiness and strength, while the ivy was said to be more symbolic of the wife for her clinging devotion and the lasting memory of their marriage. Clovers are also a symbol of the Trinity because, of course, it has 3 leaves, and it is the official symbol of Ireland, which might do double duty as a clue to where the deceased came from. Sheaves of wheat can be a simple example of iconography used to indicate the grave of a person who had lived a long life, as in over 70 years, or it can be linked to organized women's clubs like the Household of Ruth, which is the female order of the Oddfellows. Palm fronds were adapted from a Roman symbol of victory to indicate a martyr or any believer's triumph over death. And ferns are frequently combined with other symbols, or they can be used alone to symbolize humility and sincerity. The oak leaves, acorns, and tree stump symbols were really popular because of the rusticity movement during the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901. It can also tie in with the Romantic movement and the conservation movement in America. Oak tree and acorn motifs can be used to symbolize several things, and it can be found throughout Victorian era cemeteries. Oak trees were considered to be the most impressive tree in the forest, and the use of the oak leaf can mean strength, endurance, or faith and virtue. The conservation movement in America spanned the late 19th century through 1920, and recreation and preservation became a popular cultural phenomenon. Non-fraternal tree markers actually predated the Woodman of the World stones, and they remained popular through the turn of the century for several reasons. During this nature movement, other fashionable plant symbols like ferns, mushrooms, and ivy, and even small animals could be appropriately incorporated into tree markers. They were available from Sears catalogs, which made them very popular in the Midwest and in areas where there was an abundance of limestone, because that was the most frequent material used for these types of markers. The gray appearance of limestone translated more realistically to a representation of a tree. A tree stump and severed branches usually meant a life cut short. The tree stump is really one of my favorite examples, and most of the carvers took pains to make them as realistic as possible, even carving the bases like cords of wood, which you can see in the lower photo on the left. So these pictures here are a good example of what I was saying about the inroads of cultural symbols to Arkansas. The tree imagery was well known, but these examples are very likely executed by a local carver. They knew about popular styles and they utilized them in this rural cemetery in Jasper, but they don't exhibit the level of sophistication that you might see from a large company that specialized in funerary architecture. But nonetheless, they are fabulous. Of course, everyone has seen the Woodman of the World stones, but in 1883, the group was called Modern Woodman of the World, and the name was changed to Woodman of the World in 1890. These stones were provided by late 19th century fraternal benefit societies, so besides serving as a monument, they also served as advertising. You had to apply to the Sovereign Monumental Committee to obtain a stone like the one you see here. Production costs for these markers eventually rose so much that the tree stones were discontinued in the 1920s. And this is probably the largest example of the Woodman of the World stone that I've seen. This is in Batesville. And it really actually does look like a tree. When I went to the cemetery, I actually thought there was a tree cut down and wondered why they didn't pick it up. But it's really great. The hand motif was used widely from the mid-1800s to the 1930s, and it was configured in a lot of different ways. The linked hands, like the ones you see here, are the most common. Some iconography books have suggested that this means marriage, but in Arkansas, they can be found on markers for children or the unmarried, and wedding rings are never seen on these. Most of the time, the hand on the left had straight fingers, and the right side was actively grasping it with the forefinger extended, the thumb pressing the knuckles, and the others closed. But the forefinger is not always extended on every marker that you see. The left hand is usually limp, which is likely the deceased. Arkansas author Abby Burnett says she has rarely seen stones with both hands clasping in Arkansas, but you look over to the right there, and this is a configuration on a homemade marker from the early 1900s. And it's created by pressing a mold into wet concrete. It almost looks like two clasping hands, but really it could be a result of the detail from the mold not transferring very well. Most clasping hands display a lacy cuff on one wrist and a straight cuff with a cufflink or a button on the other, which would indicate male and female, but sometimes the wrists can be one gender. Suggested meanings for clasping hands would be union, reunion, or allegiance. The Bible stated that art should not show the likeness of God, so he's often depicted with the hand symbol. So again, the active hand could either be a symbol of God or it could be a marriage partner that had died previously. It's just very amorphous. Linked hands could imply the hope of meeting again, and sometimes they actually feature banners that say we will meet again or farewell for a while. And there was a custom in Arkansas funerals to take a final look at the deceased, and it was encouraged to touch them, which could give the linked hands motif another meaning. Pointing fingers are also found on grave markers, and the fingers point up and they also point down. An upward finger can be said to indicate that the deceased has gone to heaven and is victorious over death. Hands like you see here are termed presenting hands because they're clasping objects and offering. If the first two fingers are together and the deceased is a member of the clergy, then the hand is a representation of God. Downward pointing fingers could represent the hand of God coming from heaven, like the one in the middle, which is descending from the clouds. Sometimes it had three fingers pointing down to represent the Trinity, or the hand could be presenting various objects like you see here, one holding a scroll, one has roses, and the other has a cluster of grapes. Hands were displayed holding wreaths, anchors, and accepting olive branches from doves. And again, these are likely representations of God. Angels and cherubs are probably the favorite form of symbolism for most people who visit cemeteries. Angels can be sculpted in three-dimensional forms, or they can be found carved in relief. Cherubs or angels appeared on gravestones in the Northeast when slate began to be used more than sandstone. I have not run across a slate marker in Arkansas. It doesn't mean that there maybe isn't one out there, but it's not very likely. The use of marble allowed stone carvers to use more stylized abstract angels and portraits. So you begin to see more options in gravestone iconography because of the use of different materials. Early colonial stones, like the one on the upper left, did not have full-bodied angels. And this type didn't really emerge until the garden movement after 1850. Winged faces in the 18th century on stones became popular because there were supposed angel sightings at deathbeds. These winged faces reappeared in the early 19th century because of neoclassicism, but they became more human and divine at the same time as they started to evolve into these sculptural forms. So here you see the transition is from a skull, signifying these moldering remains, to a winged being that helped souls transcend and assume glory. Most life-size sculpted figures were created from marble, and they were really more about consolation instead of commemoration. This person had a future in heaven rather than being considered dead and gone. By the end of the 19th century, the symbol of death as an angel rather than skeletons and skulls took over. Angels tended to the deceased, and they also eased their transition to heaven. In the 19th century, the popularity of consolation literature that detailed the afterlife and how angels instructed new souls resulted in large numbers of angel sculptures in cemeteries. Angels were usually considered female figures in classical dress, and they symbolized faith, hope, and charity. Their growing appearance in cemeteries of the 19th century was an effect of the evolving sophistication of American art patrons in the late 18th and early 19th century that inspired angel forms. Also, angel sculptures were sold in Sears catalogs and by large monument dealers, so it evolved into this artistic choice for all classes. The advent of garden cemeteries was appropriate for these forms because one of their tasks was to decorate the grave. And you'll see a lot of angel sculptures like these extending their hand, holding a flower. Excuse me. Children are often seen being lifted to heaven by soul-bearing angels, which are usually women or childlike beings. And there have not been any sightings of male angels taking a soul to heaven on a marker, and it might be because the more feminine and smaller markers suggest innocence. Most 19th century cemetery angels are small and they're childlike. They look like they're about 5 or 6 years old, and they're usually posed praying, recording, or holding flowers. Rather than angels, when they're small like this, they're often called putti or cherubs. And these smaller angels are usually thought of as feminine beings, even on graves for boys, but they're more androgynous, which is consistent with the feminine role of keepers of the home and tenders of the dead. Other tasks of angels are displaying the book of life to remind viewers that the last judgment is imminent, or trumpeting to serve that purpose as well. And then there's the weeper angel, who's mourning for the family. And that is from a sculptor named William Wetmore. We have an example here at Oakland and Fraternal Cemetery Park. In some areas of the state, like the Ozarks or more rural areas, portraits of the deceased are not very common, but in larger cemeteries like Mount Holly and Little Rock, there were more wealthy families who could afford to have a likeness of their loved ones installed on their marker. So you can tell by looking at these that these are very prominent people in the society of 19th century Little Rock. In contrast, you can tell that this portrait of a man from Bruno in the Ozarks is not as elaborate and the carver was not as skilled, but his face on the stone would indicate that he was a well-known and perhaps wealthier person in his community. The other photo is Mr. Looper and baby George Pennington from the Looper Cemetery and the Pleasant Grove Cemetery in Scott County. They're a little more rudimentary than the Bruno marker, probably done by the same carver, but they were likely from prominent families that would merit a portrait marker. This is an example of sculptural portraits at Mount Holly in Little Rock. Sculptures of this child and her sister were commissioned from Italy by her parents, but they felt like they didn't really look like them. So they sent them back and they had them redone. The two are looked over by a classical angel figure who's decorating their plot. Then there are the Hayes, who are an eternal couple in Prescott. I'm sorry, I'm choking up. Most markers today are done in granite, but you don't see the three-dimensional images of the 19th century. So these are modern stones that have incorporated a laser-etched image of the people who were buried there. These are 21st century examples, which are becoming more common and they're becoming more elaborate. After photography was invented in 1839, patents for transferring photos to ceramic discs for gravestones were received in Europe in the 1840s. The first United States manufacturer was a company in Chicago in 1893, and early portraits were on metal rather than ceramic. Photoceramics evolved from the desire of the family to have an image of their loved one on the stone, and they didn't have to hire a carver to create them. Also, they would be assured that it actually looked like them. The portraits were more than just a picture of the deceased. They also told us a little bit about them, like the epitaph used to, but these were more realistic. You would see people with their beloved pets, or they would be participating in hobbies they liked. If you see the modern photo ceramic on the bottom reveals that this 16-year-old boy had a good sense of humor. So it's very revealing. It tells the story in the place of that epitaph. We discussed the urn before in combination with the willow, but the urn was also featured alone many times. And in the early 1800s, the urn as a funerary symbol or a device really dominated. Again, the urn was a neoclassical image, and it was used primarily as a decorative device rather than to convey a message. The vernacular image of an urn in the middle there was found in the Jasper Cemetery, and it doesn't really look like an urn, but it shows that local carvers recognized the imagery as a popular form, and they utilized it as sort of an easel for other symbols. You saw in the urns that they were covered in drapery, and using the urn as this artistic device with a pall or a drapery over it added a layer of symbolism to the urn. It served as a symbol of the passage from one plane to another. Abby Burnett stated that a pall was a cloth that covers a casket, and this could also be an inspiration for the drapery that you see on gravestones. The curtain veil served as a protection when it was used to cover the Ark of the Covenant, but it also conveyed the sadness of mourners like the willow did. And like the willow, it was just a natural symbol for gravestones, so it was used very extensively. It covered columns, covered the urn, it covered Bibles and funeral biers for babies, and it could be combined with symbols like the clasping hands and fraternal symbols like you see on the lower right. The lamb is a funerary symbol that a lot of people like. It's said to symbolize innocence, which probably is what makes it appealing to people, but I like them because they're very subject to the skills of the carver, which makes them very interesting. Some of them look like buffalo and some look like dachshunds, but that's what makes them so charming, and that's what makes each gravestone different. They were particularly used for infants, and it can be tied to the depiction of Christ as the Lamb of God. In these photos, you see all those different levels of skill that I was talking about. On the lower left is a lamb done by Nick Miller, who is a German carver, and he came to Arkansas and worked on several cemeteries. His gravestones are found in at least 7 counties of Northwest Arkansas. And I like this gravestone particularly because it's been laying on the ground for who knows how many decades. But if you look at that lamb, the detail on it is still really crisp, and it still conveys the image that it's supposed to convey for that family. Now, this lamb was created by a man named Mayberry, and the people that commissioned it ended up not wanting to pay for it, so he kept it for his own use. The lamb was not carved with ears, and at some point, the ears were created using spoons. The marble eyes that you see on it were present at carving. And I really like the picture of the babies with the Mayberry lamb because that conveys how families were involved in funerary traditions and how much that gravestone meant when they picked it out and they chose it for their family. Doves are often used in Hebrew and Christian imagery, and they're also used a lot of times on children's graves, but not exclusively. The dove was featured in the New Testament, and it appeared at Jesus' birth, baptism, and also just before his death. When you hear the cooing sound of a dove, it's very mournful, which, like the willow, makes it popular for funerary symbolism. The dove presenting an olive branch to Noah after the flood was a sign for God that life had returned and punishment was over, which can be translated easily to mourning symbols and a new life in heaven. So here you see the dove symbol. It's combined with the tree stump up on the upper left, which is a life cut short. You have the dove with the pall, the dove with the hand of God, and the dove with flowers in urns. Broken columns are again a symbol of life cut short or the end of life, and they were requested often in mid-19th century cemeteries. They were often draped with the curtain veil and tassels. Now the column is primarily a sculptural image, but there is one example in relief in the middle there in the Eureka Springs Cemetery, and that is the only one that I've seen like that. Books can be sculptural as well as bas-relief. Any book can represent the Bible, which is what most people take them to be. Closed books usually represent a completed life, and open books are like the Book of Life for registering the name of the deceased. Many times they're placed on a pulpit-style marker like the ones you see here. Inverted torches are another symbol of life cut short, and you don't see it very often, but it was a favorite neoclassical image. If the flame is still burning, then it means that the interred is not truly gone, but they're existing in another world. Hourglasses, like the one that I showed you before on the right, is seen in combination with the torches. They're not seen that often in Arkansas, but it's obvious imagery as well. Besides the passing of time, on the East Coast, it's thought to be influenced by the use of the hourglass in churches during sermons. One sermon would start, the hourglass would be turned over, and then you turned it back over, and you had a little more time to spend in church and more sermons to hear. Anchors stand as a symbol of hope, and it can often be a cross in disguise. The first Christians had to practice their religion in secret, so they would use an anchor to attract other followers. A form of Egyptian architecture found in cemeteries are obelisks, which represent a ray of sunshine. Also, it represented the god of creation. Obelisks were considered pagan symbols, so most American obelisks have Christian symbols on them to mitigate the shock, like there might be a palm frond or an Easter lily. Obelisks came in all sizes. You could get them in extra large, large, medium, and small. And the largest, like the one you see here, would indicate a family of standing in the community, while medium ones were likely stock forms that were bought from monument companies. And then you can see a very tiny one in the Utica Springs Cemetery marking the grave of a child. And I have seen other, they're around, the really small ones. During the war years, garden aesthetics in cemeteries started to change, and technology and industrialization began to be emphasized more. Efficiency and economy began to be admired more than humanism. Profit making came to the forefront, and mechanized design changed gravestones in cemetery landscapes. When you started dealing with the funeral home industry, that really took the family out of the equation. The deceased was no longer cared for by the family or the community members. So this changed the landscape of cemeteries and artistic influences on funerary architecture. For a little while, you might see some degree of decorative work, but they really cut the frills and the sculpture way down. Carving was shallower because it was done by machines, and epitaphs were not as involved. Then you started seeing the ground markers that had no decorative concessions at all, so that lawnmowers could make it through the cemetery more easily. Angel markers had died out by the 1930s. The hand motif had completely disappeared after the turn of the century. And most hands you see now are the praying hands. The primary material for gravestones now is granite, which can be sandblasted without having any carving skills. And for a long time, these granite markers only featured the deceased's name and not always with death date information. They were very, very minimal. Lately, however, granite stones have started featuring some pretty extensive dioramas that relate the story of the person buried there. They indicate their likes and their hobbies, just like the photoceramics did. So they've kind of come full circle with more of an in-your-face iconography that isn't dependent on symbolism. This one on the right, this is in Arkansas. We don't know the story behind it, but it's using color, it's using dolphins, there are exotic birds, it's a jungle scene. So it's very personal, it's a personal story. When I went to Spring Grove Cemetery in Ohio, there was a granite marker in the cemetery that was a depiction of SpongeBob SquarePants wearing a military uniform. And this was chosen by the girl and her sister, who when she went, she was going to have SpongeBob SquarePants in a Navy uniform because they were both part of those groups. When they put the SpongeBob up, the other people in the cemetery who had plots nearby were not happy with it because they felt that it didn't really reflect the gravity of the cemetery and what they expected from it. But they fought back, and they were able to have SpongeBob in the cemetery. They just had to put a border of bushes around it to kind of hide it. So that's how much these gravestones, when you saw the babies with the gravestone before, that's how much it meant to the family to have a picture of the babies with it. And now the gravestones are starting to mean something again to the people who are buried today. And lastly, sometimes the symbolism on graves is provided by objects that physically represent the loved one in very exuberant and supremely personal ways. And I really like these. They really pile on the symbolism just like it was piled on before, with every kind of conceivable flower that you could imagine being carved into it. Now they're putting toys and flowers and pinwheels and statues, and it's just a very happy thing to me. And that is symbolism and iconography in Arkansas.
Thank you very much, Holly. That was so interesting. I'm just going to jump in and share my thoughts as far as just the parallels between what's going on in the socioeconomic world and taste in the living world that comes across in the symbolism in the cemeteries. So that's quite telling. And the other thing that I thought was interesting was just the commercialization, really. I mean, we see it, when we have Sears and Roebuck's catalogs, you can select what you want. And then when you said everything became much more commercialized, certainly when the funeral home industry kind of took over, and then you see a shift. So that must be really interesting when you go out to cemeteries. You can almost just by looking at it, tell when it's from, even before you've seen an epitaph. I mean, I think that's quite interesting. Yeah. I know this isn't the subject of your talk tonight, but you did show some of the beautiful statues that are at Mount Holly, which were unfortunately recently vandalized, but it looks like they've been very well preserved. So, or I guess restored, really. Yeah. So, in addition to the research you do and working on National Register nominations and Arkansas Register nominations, you also do cemetery workshops. So I thought we should put that out there too. And you've done them throughout the state. And I know you work with student groups too, because I've participated in one of your, when we were working together at AHPP, one of your programs that was set up for students, homeschooled students, which was wonderful. So I don't think I have any questions coming up yet, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to jump in and ask them. Shelley, did you have any questions come through YouTube?
No.
Not at this point. All right. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Holly, about your findings and what is most remarkable about what you have found in your travels throughout the state, which I know are extensive?
Well, really, to me, the vernacular ones are more heartfelt. I mean, not any less so from the family, however you choose to have it made or however you choose to have your message conveyed, but the vernacular ones just are amazing to me, with maybe marbles or bottle caps put in them. And I wrote an article about iconography in Drew County, and I just hit the ground and went to several different cemeteries in the area. And I started noticing there were these concrete slant markers that had a little impressed flower in them. It always had that impressed flower. Sometimes it had a star, or the flower was arranged a different way. It had 4 petals. It had these particular leaves. And I just called them the 4-point flower man or woman, whoever made them, because I couldn't find any information about it, but they were everywhere in Drew County. And starting from the 1930s and on up into the 40s, I noticed them. And I'm still curious as to who this person was. Because
that's what I was going to say. Were you able to identify the person who executed them? Or maybe my other thought would be that someone saw it and said, oh, I want to have this on my marker when I go as well. It could be power of persuasion.
And you know what I liked about it was that they were in African American cemeteries as well as white cemeteries.
So, and we really didn't talk much about that as far as different iconography in cemeteries that were Caucasian or African American. Do you see that the symbolism is universal? Is that basically what you're getting to?
Yeah, it's just executed differently. I see a lot of angel faces in Black cemeteries. I see the cross. One that was really interesting that we came across recently was in a cemetery we just listed on the Arkansas Register in Lonoke County, the Macedonia Baptist Cemetery. And they didn't know it was there, but they dug it up, and it was a really thick, bulky concrete marker in the shape of a Gothic arch.
Wow.
It had a panel embedded in the concrete that was ceramic. And the panel was an urn, and it had these hands clasping the urn. It was three-dimensional on this panel, and the hands were tinted pink, and they had red fingernail polish on them. And then they had built like a border around the panel with, it looked like strips of marble, maybe little leftover pieces of marble. And the base had some, it looked like stucco buttered in with a knife or something. So it was just all kinds of layers of features. And I thought it was one of the more beautiful ones I've seen, and something I had never seen before as well.
Right. So very unique, obviously. And what's amazing to me is that you report that it was not known. Was it buried, just overgrowth, and just disappeared over time?
Yeah.
Wow. And I know that we have an issue with that. Obviously, cemeteries that are associated with homesteads that get forgotten, unfortunately, many times as well. So it's a challenging job to do that. I don't think we have any questions, but we did have a comment from Frances Ross. She just said, thank you for a very interesting program. And I'll echo that as well. As always, I always learn something from the research that you've undertaken, and appreciate all that you do. Not only in Little Rock,
Sorry, I choked up.
Well, no, it's that time of year. There's still stuff floating around out there. So really, thank you very much, Holly. I don't think Shelley had any questions to add on to it. Nope. Gotcha. Okay. So we will, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen just for a couple of announcements before everyone jumps off. Let me do that. There we go. So what I'd like to announce before you all jump off is our next upcoming preservation conversation. And it will be on Thursday, November the 11th. Jonathan Hancock, PhD, will present the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811, 1812, the Quapaw Nation, and Little Rock. He's actually recently published a book, and I have a photo of it there if you can see behind our images. And we're hoping that we could have done it in person and we could do a book signing. We have not done in-person preservation conversations yet, so we will alert you to that. Whether or not, assume we'll be virtual, we will let you know if we're going to do it in person. So we're looking forward to that talk. And then also, I want to make sure that everybody is aware of our annual meeting. We are going to be holding that in person. It is going to be Wednesday, November the 3rd at the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center. We will have a reception from 5 to 6 o'clock and the business meeting and presentation of the Greater Little Rock Preservation Awards between 6 and 7. And it is a members only event. So if you're not a member, please join. You can RSVP and join at quapaw.com. And we are going to request or require that you have proof of vaccination to participate in the meeting, and wear a mask if you're not eating or drinking. So I think that's it for tonight. Signing off. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Holly, for the lovely presentation. And thank you, Shelley, for all of your logistics work. Bye, everybody.